Good afternoon. The hearing session is now open. It forms part of the examination of the Waverley Local Plan Part 2. My name is GJ Fort and I am the inspector appointed by the Secretary of State to conduct the examination and to report to the Council in due course. The format of the hearing is a structured and focused discussion that I shall lead. So before we move on any further, could I ask Mr. Beglin to introduce the Council representatives, please?
So yes, good afternoon. Wayne Beglin of Council for Waverley Borough Council. I have with me this afternoon Miss Alice Knowles and Mr. Ian Brewster, who is a Trees and Landscape Officer with the local authority.
And others in the room, please.
Good afternoon. My name is John Shepherd of J&J Design, and I represent Magnum Land and Homes. So.
Thank you. And those joining us on Zoom, please.
My name is Dr. Alexandrina Leclisio. I'm the chairman of the Frith Hill Area Residents Association, and we've been following the plan since its inception.
Thank you. So Charlotte Glancy is the programme officer for the examination, and she should be the main point of contact prior to and after the hearing sessions and should be copied into all correspondence. Just pass over to Charlotte now for our housekeeping remarks.
Just to read out the fire notice. In the unlikely event of fire or other serious incident, the alarm in this building is a siren. If alarms are inoperative or inadvisable in a bomb emergency, the instruction to leave will be given by word of mouth. If the alarm sounds, leave by the nearest safe fire exit. Please note the position of fire exits from this room. Do not stop to reclaim personal effects. Do not use the lift. And proceed to the assembly point, which is at the far end of the Berries playing field opposite the council offices during the day until 6:30 in the evening. And then after 6:30, it's Waitrose car park. And please remain at the evacuation point until instructed that it's safe to re-enter the building. And the toilets are just at the end of the corridor, turn right and on the right-hand side. Many thanks.
The hearings are being filmed and live streamed. I take it everyone present is comfortable with that. Dr. Leclisio?
Yes, fine.
The matters to be discussed today will be focused questions based upon taking forward the matters, issues and questions and associated written statements received. I am tasked with considering the soundness of the plan in accordance with the criteria of the National Planning Policy Framework and also whether it is legally compliant. The hearings are intended to assist me in that regard. In submitting the plan, the Council considers that it is a sound one, and this is the starting point for the examination. So if you are challenging the soundness of the plan, then you have to explain why and what changes might be necessary that would make it sound. I have read and will take into account the hearing statements that have been prepared and also the original representations that were made. So there is no need for these to be substantially repeated. Instead, the aim is that the discussion moves on from those documents and deals with specific questions that I have or areas where further clarification or explanation are required. At times, I may ask for a more general contribution or a summary of your position. Contributors would stick to the matter in hand and refrain from commenting on unrelated matters. In order to test the plan for soundness and legal compliance, I will need to ask questions. You will have seen that I have already been doing this in preliminary questions in correspondence with the Council, in the published matters, issues and questions document, and in earlier hearing sessions. And both the Council and other participants have responded to these. So the questions will continue this afternoon. However, anything that is asked should not be taken as demonstrating a particular predisposition on my part. I will normally start a particular topic by asking the Council for responses to questions I have before indicating that I wish others to comment. For those of you in the room, if you wish to comment, then please do so please indicate this by turning your nameplate on its side. And if you are joining us via Zoom, if you could use the hands up tool that's available in that program. I may also invite contributions from you on specific points where I think this may assist the examination. In the course of the discussions, if you wish to highlight certain parts of your statement or other documents that form part of the examination, then it will be helpful to me if you can provide the references. Those present in the room should use the microphones when speaking to me, and those joining us on Zoom will have to make sure they are unmuted when speaking to me and muted at all other times. Those joining us on Zoom experience technical difficulties, they should make contact with the programme officer in the first instance. It is open to the council to propose further changes to the plan, and I would ask that they keep a record of possible changes that arise during the discussions this afternoon. Any changes that will constitute main modifications will be subject to future consultation. So the examination remains open until my final report is submitted to the council. However, no further representations or evidence will be accepted after the hearing sessions have finished, unless I specifically request otherwise. Moreover, I'm not expecting any further written submissions during the course of hearing sessions, but I may request further material should discussions indicate that that would be useful. As usual, there'll be a short session at the end of today to ensure that any suggested modifications or additional items, such as topic papers or other evidence I may request, suggested during the course of discussions, have been adequately recorded. So are there any procedural questions about the hearings at this juncture? Okay, if we can move on to our substantive discussion for this afternoon, which relates to matter 12. And it's related to the plan's approach to landscapes, trees, and open spaces. So by way of introduction to this topic, I'd like to invite the council to outline whether the plan's approach to nationally and locally designated landscapes is justified, consistent with national policy, and effective.
Thank you, sir. So the strategic approach to national and local landscape designations is set out in Local Plan Part 1, particularly policy RE3. However, the detailed boundaries of some of the locally designated sites are set out in Local Plan Part 2. Detailed reviews were undertaken for these local landscape designations in accordance with the criteria set out in Local Plan Part 1, and the methodology for each is set out in the relevant topic paper. And the council is putting forward 2 main modifications in relation to the areas of strategic visual importance, which I'll come back to in a moment. Local Plan Part 2 also sets out the detailed development management policy on trees and hedgerows, which covers both trees which are protected by designations such as ancient woodland, as well as trees more generally across the borough. And a number of local green spaces are also designated through Local Plan Part 2. And policy DM19 sets out how these will be protected. And the council is also putting forward a main modification, MM60, to the wording of policy DM19 to ensure consistency with the MPPF, which we can come back to later. In relation to the main modifications for the ASVIs, the first of these is MM1, which actually relates to the modification to remove the proposed Hazelmere settlement boundaries from Local Plan Part 2 following the adoption of the Hazelmere neighbourhood plan. And the reason for that, sir, is that in undertaking the review of the boundary for the ASVI, the deliberate decision was taken to align the boundary of the ASVI with the settlement boundary due to the purpose of the ASVIs in protecting land which is vulnerable to development pressure and small open pockets on the urban fringe. And therefore, we're putting forward MM1 to align the ASVI boundary in that location with the settlement boundary put forward in the Hazelmere neighbourhood plan. And MM2 proposes an amendment to the Rowledge ASVI boundary, which is one of the ASVIs located in Farnham. And the reason for that, sir, is so the current ASVI boundary designated in the 2002 local plan runs through the centre of a particular site. And therefore, as part of local plan part 2, the council were putting forward a modification so that the boundary followed a defined boundary on the ground. And at that point in time, when the review of the boundary was undertaken, there was a planning consent for one dwelling on that particular piece of land. And the council took the decision at that time to therefore exclude that particular site from the ASVI. However, prior to the final topic paper being completed in November 2020, that planning permission had expired, and that was not picked up on at that time. And although a new planning application was made on the site, this was refused and subsequently an appeal against this decision dismissed. And the reason for the change in position as to whether a dwelling was acceptable on that site was due to the adoption of the Farnham neighbourhood plan between those two applications. So as a result of this, the evidence to support the boundary in this location was out of date, and the council undertook a review of the updated evidence and a further site visit, and therefore puts forward an amended boundary under MM2 to now include that site within the ASVI. And based on the approach that is set out in the relevant topic papers, sir, we consider that the approach is consistent with the national policy and justified.
Thank you. There's a few things there that we'll return to further down through the course of the discussion. But I think turning firstly to the Farnham Aldershot strategic gap. So could you outline the reasoning for the inclusion of segment 2D? That's as identified in the topic paper. It's LPP2 CD2 40C in the settlement boundary that appears in the local plan part 2.
Yes, sir. So each of these segments that have been identified were assessed in accordance with the methodology for the boundary review, which is set out in chapter 4 of that topic paper. And that's in line with what was set out in the relevant part of local plan part 1. And so that the first thing that was considered in terms of segment 2D was what was said in the local landscape evidence, which was undertaken for local plan part 1. And that set out that the area to the east around Bagshot Lee was not so successful against the aspirations of the strategic gap policy, as that was already mixed character. However, the eastern part does provide a stronger visual gap landscape to the area. And the council's assessment of that site based on additional site visits and consideration was that the segment identifies a significant stretch of the boundary between Waverley and Rushmore boroughs, and the broad area identified in local plan part 1 was a smaller area. That's the broad area identified for the strategic gap in local plan part 1 is a small area running along the Waverley Rushmore boundary. However, officers considered that the whole segment should be included in the new strategic gap because the majority of the segment is open and green as a result of the historic mineral workings on the site being turned into a local nature reserve. And we consider that it therefore complies with the purposes of the policy. The southwest section is more mixed in its uses, including residential and commercial uses. However, as a result of the deep vegetation separating this area from the main road, officers feel that it's more appropriate for the designation to include this section.
So the topic paper in the sort of analysis of those segments, there's a section on relevant planning applications and appeal decisions. So were there any that were particularly relevant to that parcel, and what conclusions did you draw from them?
Thank you, sir. I expect probably what you're making reference to is the appeal decision, which was appended to the representation made by J&J Design on behalf of Magnum Land and Homes. So that is appeal decision reference APP R3650W 163161635 relates to land at Summerfield Cottage on Rumfold St George in Badshot Lee. And that was a Section 78 appeal for planning permission for 3 dwellings, and that sits within segment 2D. And the relevant parts of that appeal decision, which deal with the strategic gap, are paragraphs 17 to probably 22. And the inspector in this case did consider that the site provides modest contribution to the strategic gap. However, the council recognises that obviously in terms of a Section 78 appeal, the inspector is only looking at that site individually, whereas for the purposes of plan making, we're looking at that site within the wider segment. And so despite the conclusions drawn for this particular site, we still feel that the segment as a whole complies with the criteria for the strategic gap policy.
Just looking at that appeal decision, so this is the only one I've been referred to or provided with, sorry, in relation to this designation. But at paragraph 22 of the inspector's decision letter there, he talks about another one. I accept my conclusions differ from those of the inspector dealing with development of the adjacent site. And then he highlights some features of that site. I mean, do you draw any conclusions from what the inspector said in that paragraph?
Yes, sir. So we have set those out on page 22 of the topic paper, which is included in a table which, oh, sorry, sir, page 21. Yeah, sorry, they start on page 20 and falls over to page 21 of the topic paper. And whilst the appeal, which we just discussed, was allowed, there were 2 previous appeals in that segment which were dismissed. And as you say, sir, the views of the inspector in those 2 cases did differ from the views of the inspector in relation to the appeal that we've just discussed. And as set out in the topic paper, we've had regard to all of those decisions made by the inspectors, as well as our own assessment of the site.
Mr. Shepherd.
Thank you, sir. Yes, sir, I would, I think you've got my original comments and my hearing statement. I won't repeat those, sir, but I would like to draw your attention to Local Plan Part 1, paragraph 13.39, which describes the Farnham and Aldershot strategic gap. And I'd just like to draw attention to the wording that says that it has an important role in preventing the coalescence of Farnham and Aldershot. And I'd just like you to reflect on that, sir, as when you think about this particular segment, and this southwest corner of the segment, as to how it performs in relation to that objective. So the second thing I'd like to draw your attention to, if I may, is that I haven't got the reference, I'm afraid, but I'm sure you'll be familiar with it. This council is actually proposing a draft allocation for a gypsy pitch on the site to the north of my client's area of interest. And we find it a little inconsistent that the council is actually promoting even that form of development within the strategic gap, and yet resisting the proposed change to the boundary.
Thank you, Mr. Shepherd. So if memory serves, that's DS 18.
Yes, sir, I think that's DS 18.
So have you got any reflections on Mr. Shepherd's points?
Thank you, sir. So in our view, the nature of gypsy and traveller accommodation is different to that of bricks and mortar residential development scheme. And we feel that a gypsy and traveller allocation could be brought forward on that site and still allow the strategic gap to form its purpose.
Yeah. So if I might just adding on that, when one looks at the area that DS18 will occupy, we acknowledge first of all that it is in common with the other proposed gypsy and traveller provision an extension of an existing site, first of all. Secondly, in terms of its actual size, it's of a modest size. And then when one compares that to the segment that we're concerned with, overall, it's a small proportion of that. So bearing in mind the nature of the development that's being proposed there, it's not an attack on the soundness of the proposal to have this area protected, that there may be some modest level of low-key development within part of the segment.
And in terms of that sort of strategic point and the reference that we've been given in LPP 1, so the gap's role in preventing coalescence of Farnham and Aldershot.
Yes, well, so that's right. And of course, an important part of strategic gaps, and the reason the policy is framed in the way that it is that if officers don't look at a relatively broad area as they did in relation to this segment to ensure that it's fully protected, then what happens is that there tends to be an erosion over time by planning applications at the edges of the site that hasn't been protected. And so that's why The protection here is to do with applications that will cause or contribute to coalescence. And so you'll be familiar with that as a very standard form of words when it comes to successful gap policies.
Any further points, Mr. Shepherd?
No, sir, I don't have any particular points unless I can help you with anything else. I think I've outlined why we think it's not sound in this respect and what changes we're looking for.
Thank you. And I'll reflect on your points and the council's position as the examination progresses. As I noted the other day when we were talking about the Gypsum Traveller site, it is somewhere that I intend to visit. With those sort of points in mind and the evidence that I've received so far, I'll take those points into account. So if we could move on to Godalming hillsides. So what's the, if you outline the rationale for the combination of the hillsides designation with the Frith Hill ASEC and the methodology for the boundary review?
Thank you, sir. So yes, local plan part 2 is proposing to combine both the Thrift Hill area of special environmental quality and Godalming hillsides designations. These are both designations that have existed in local plans in the borough for quite some time. The Thrift Hill ASEQ first appeared in the Godalming Town Map Review of 1974, and the Godalming hillsides first featured in a Woodland Settings policy introduced in the 1984 local plan. And the justification for combining the two designations is set out in chapter 4 of the topic paper, which is LPP2 CD 09. The reason for this is looking at the history of both the designations. The council feels that the purpose of both these designations is actually the same, and there are areas which are covered by both designations. And so given the similarities in purpose and geographical extent of these two policies, the council considered it's appropriate to assess whether those policies should be combined. And having undertaken that review, the council considers that the same level of protection for these areas could be provided by combining them into a single policy.
So some boundary changes are proposed. Could you just briefly outline the rationale for those, please?
Yes, sir. So the council undertook a review of the existing areas covered by both the Godalming hillsides and the Thrift Hill ASEQ. And given that the purpose of these is focused on both hillsides and woodland, the council looked at whether the current areas designated actually covered areas which are woodland on hillsides, and found that in some locations, there were some anomalies in that, and potentially some of those have arisen because these are old designations which have been moved from paper maps onto more up-to-date maps, and therefore the exact position of the woodland has varied slightly over time. So the council is wanting to tighten up on those areas which are covered by the policy.
Thank you. Dr. Leclésio, did you have any views on this particular matter?
Yes, thank you very much, sir. I have 2 points. First of all, we did object to combining the designations for these 2 areas. And that was based on our view that the area of special environmental quality, which comprises Frith Hill, is different from that of the Godalming Hillsides designation in general. If I can take you to chapter 5 of the plan, 5.7, policy RE3, development will not be acceptable on the Godalming Hillsides unless the council is satisfied that the development would not diminish the wooded appearance of the hillside and result in loss of tree cover and to the detriment of the area and the character and setting of the town. Now, with the Godalming ASEQ designation is derived from policy GOD 12/13, which is in the Godalming local plan. And that specifies additional points in that the skyline needs to be retained by natural features at the highest points. And development should avoid being at a height that is prominent on the skyline, and must ensure that if it is visible, then it can be clearly demonstrated how this enhances the character and setting of the area. So we feel quite strongly that these 2 areas, Godalming Hillsides and the Godalming ASEQ for Frith Hill, are separate designations and should be retained as such. The second point is about boundary corrections, and we did assist the council when we looked at the plan with drawings which provided a more up-to-date designation of Frith Hill. We have an architect who has lived in the town for many years and was able to make quite calculated drawings for the council's assistance. And we understand that that was probably, as the council says, a result of transferring hard copy to digital. But we hope that the new boundaries do reflect our comments. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Leclésio. Just in terms of how you think the plan could be altered in those regards, do you think there should be a specific policy relating to the Frith Hill designation that's separate to the hillsides?
Yes, thank you, sir. We would like to see the Godalming local plan designation GOD 12/13 incorporated into the Waverley local plan specifically, because we feel that the skyline comments in GOD 12/13 are specific to Frith Hill and are not included as general comments in RE3. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. So any responses to those points?
Thank you, sir. Just to say that with respect to the policy in the Godalming neighbourhood plan, both the Godalming neighbourhood plan and local plan and part 1 and 2 will form part of the development plan, and therefore we don't consider that it's necessary to repeat that policy from the Godalming neighbourhood plan within local plan part 2, as that policy sets out that it will apply to whatever area is designated as the Godalming Hillsides in Local Plan Part 2.
Just a reminder, I did request early on in the examination for neighbourhood plans to be uploaded to the examination library. Is the Godalming one there?
Apologies, I can't recall off the top of my head, sir, but if it's not there, we will make sure that it is there for you.
Right, thank you. So I suggest what I'll do in regards to this particular point is cross-reference the neighbourhood plan against the parts 1 and 2 of the local plan with the comments I've heard this afternoon, with a view to whether any further modifications are necessary. But that would be something I'd handle in post hearings correspondence. Is there anything further, Dr. Leclésio, on this point?
Thank you, sir. We'd be grateful if you would cross-reference in that regard. We're just concerned that the Godalming neighbourhood plan description, which is more detailed than the Godalming Hillsides reference, is not somehow ignored or subsumed into a lower, in our view, designation of general Godalming Hillsides. So we'd like to make it clear that in any development that specific requirement to maintain the skyline is kept. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, if we could move on now to the Hazelmere Hillsides. And if I could ask the council just to outline in general the general justification for the approach that's taken in the local plan part 2 in that respect.
Thank you, sir. So the Hazelmere Hillsides was actually one of the local landscape designations which was not considered or reviewed as part of local plan part 1, and therefore local plan part 2 has looked at both the need for the designation and a review of the boundary, and does therefore include a policy on the Hazelmere Hillsides as that hasn't been set out in local plan part 1. And just by way of a quick bit of background, as with the Godalming Hillsides, this policy also comes from a policy called Woodland Settings, which was first introduced in the 1984 local plan, and also a further policy in the 1993 local plan, which was included to preserve the green hillside to the south of the Hazelmere Conservation Area by restricting new development unless the development would not diminish the wooded appearance and result in loss of a tree cover or have a detrimental effect on the character of the Hazelmere Conservation Area. And that's where this current policy continues to provide that protection to the setting of the Hazelmere Conservation Area. and the methodology for reviewing the policy and the area that it covers is set out in the topic paper, sir, which is LPP2 CD 08. And the methodology is set out in chapter 4, and the review of the need for the designation and the boundary set out in chapter 5. And just by way of summary of that review of the need for the designation, taking all things into consideration, the council considers that the specific designation draws attention to the need to retain the wooded appearance in that area, and the council considers that it's likely, if the designation were to be removed, that it would result in harm to the conservation area.
So I picked up that point on the phrasing of paragraph 415, which sort of is the preamble to the policy itself, the M17. And I take the point in the hearing statement about the importance of tree cover and in relation to the conservation area and so forth. However, just reflecting on what paragraph 415 says and what criterion B of DM17 says, so that paragraph 415 says, this therefore means that the loss of any trees could cause significant harm to the setting of the conservation area. And then criterion B says, not result in a material loss of tree cover to the detriment of the character of the Hazelmere Town Centre conservation area. It's a small point, but does the use of the word any in the paragraph 415 sort of, it reads as perhaps slightly more restrictive than what the policy itself says?
So I think it can be read in that way. Well, what we would say in terms of soundness is that it's the policy that will, of course, govern the decision making ultimately, albeit that will be interpreted by using the explanatory text as one assist in that exercise. And what 415 goes to perhaps emphasize is that because of the presence of the conservation area and the other sensitivities to which attention has been drawn, it's one of those examples where a material loss of tree cover may be really a very modest level of loss compared to other circumstances. And so what the explanatory text is doing is just really reinforcing the fact that in these particular local circumstances, any loss of tree cover could be a significant issue. Not that it will be in every case, but that it could be. And so that's giving some further assistance to the decision maker in relation to what level of tree loss is likely or risks being a material loss.
Okay, thank you for that explanation, Mr. Beglan. That's useful. So if we move on to the ASVIs. So we've touched on the main modifications and the reasoning for those. But in terms of the role of neighbourhood plans in reviewing and setting ASVI boundaries, so what's their role and what is the rationale for that approach?
Thank you, sir. So the role of neighbourhood plans in terms of the ASVIs, specifically relates to the Cranley neighbourhood plan. And they have requested to undertake a review of the Cranley ASVI through their neighbourhood plan, so that the local community can really have that local input into what that boundary is. And the council considers that can be an appropriate route for that to be done, given that the strategic approach to the ASVIs has already been set out in Local Plan Part 1.
Okay, and what did Local Plan Part 1 say in general about neighbourhood plans role in those non-strategic?
So while we're looking for references dealing with that specific topic, it's probably worth observing as a more general matter that, of course, Local Plan Part 1 does in fact confer a significant degree of, if not autonomy, then certainly power on those who are responsible for the neighbourhood planning process to take forward certain local elements of plan making. And a good example of that is in relation to the Greenbelt, for example, where the approach that was in LPP 1 was commended by Inspector Bohr in parts of his report. And one can take that from example from page 13, paragraphs 46 and 47, but so you'll be well familiar with that report. And the general tenor of it was that it was supportive of the positive approach that Waverley had taken to conferring power on neighbourhood planning bodies to deal with these kinds of issues. So in that more general sense, there was certainly support within the process that led to the adoption of LPP1 for neighbourhood planning to address these kinds of issues. Now, I'll just see with Ms Knowles whether there's anything that we can immediately lay our hands on that's more specific in relation to the ASVIs. Yeah, so it's probably fair to observe that within Local Plan Part 1 itself, within paragraph 13.46, the main reference there to how anomalies within the ASVIs will be dealt with is within Part 2. But of course, the extent to which Cranley may wish to revisit this issue may potentially go beyond issues that one might regard as an anomaly. And so insofar as we go back to the general principle and approach of LPP1 that I've been sketching out, that sort of approach within neighbourhood planning would be consistent with the overarching tone and tenor, as it were, of LPP1.
So I suppose the practical outcome of the exercise insofar as the local plan part 2 is concerned is that the boundary as existing is carried forward until the Cranley neighbourhood plan is adopted.
So that's right, and of course that plan will have to go through all the usual processes that apply there, with its examination and test as to whether or not that planning process meets the basic conditions, and then in furtherance of the general principles of local decision making, it will be subject to referendum in the usual way.
Thank you. You recall we discussed last week what the local plan part 2 could do in terms of remedial approach, remedial measures, I think was a term we used, where neighbourhood plans weren't adopted in as sort of rapidly as perhaps was expected when LPP1 was adopted, but I don't intend to go any further on that today because we've discussed that already. So now moving on to policy DM 11. So that this was where there's a reference to important trees and also a reference to valued trees. So there's just a simple point here that I don't prefer one term to the other, but for the sake of consistency and clarity, either pick one or the other, or, you know, important or valued trees as a phrase. Any views on that?
So yes, agreed. We need to have consistency there. We'll take that away and decide which term is preferable.
Dr. Leclésio?
Thank you, sir. In relation to important or valued trees, we are still interested in ancient woodland. We do know that there is some designated ancient woodland on Frith Hill, but we've never seen a plan which specifies exactly how much it covers. We have local residents' knowledge of what it covers, but we'd be grateful for a plan from the council to ensure that it is protected. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Any reflections on that? In general terms, Mr. Brewster?
Thank you, sir. Yes, there are indicators, floral indicators within woodland that would suggest that they are ancient woodland. Ancient woodland tend to be those that were around in the 1600s, but if they're not marked on a plan, for example, then woodland indicators, floral indicators would suggest that they may be older. Some woodland may be older than considered as a replanting. So it probably would be something that a surveyor or a local friends of group could perhaps carry out and then provide the information that would suggest that they are indeed ancient rather than replanted woodland. Thank you, sir.
But that's not something the council holds, or Natural England have information on it at present in relation to that specific area.
Thank you, sir. Not that I'm aware of, maybe the Forestry Commission, but if it's not designated ancient woodland, then it's something that perhaps an inventory or some resource would provide or carry out. Not sure that it's a function that Forestry Commission would carry out unless there's an indicator that suggests that they are ancient woodland, and then obviously then add that to the inventory list of ancient woodland areas. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. So in terms of how this might relate to the local plan part 2, obviously we've got the policy protection for ancient woodland in general. Have you got any reflections, Mr. Beglin, in terms of Dr. Leclesio's point?
So the protection of ancient woodland is obviously an important policy concern of the local planning authority, and that's why DM11 will be putting in place the clear protection that we say is, and we hope you will agree, is consistent with national policy and otherwise meets the test of soundness. But the plan does observe in the explanatory text that whilst many, this is paragraph 2.77 on page 42, whilst many ancient woodlands are identified on the planning maps, lower density and smaller woodlands may not be identified. And so what will of course need to happen is whenever any section 78 planning application or appeal under section 78 comes forward, there will need to be a precise consideration of the extent of any ancient woodland and whether or not there might be any breach of policy at DM11 in that respect. And that will provide the level of protection that we suspect that those who are concerned about ancient woodland are seeking to achieve. So whilst it might be, as it were, ideal to be able to have all of this reflected in a map or plan, the information that the local authority has access to that hasn't allowed that to happen as part of LPP2. It's not necessary to the soundness of LPP2, but we hope that we can persuade those who are listening that the policy protection that will be contained within LPP2 will be sufficient to deal with individual planning applications that the authority will then have to decide under these policies.
Thank you. Dr. Leclesio, any further points on that?
Thank you, sir. We are reassured by the council's comments. We would, however, just like to make a note that planning officers are directed to this when they look at planning, because with a long familiarity of planning applications, some of the applications just dismiss ancient woodland as no, not affected. And we'd just like to make clear that the planning officers need to bear it in mind. Thank you. We will investigate the Forestry Commission and Natural England to see if they can help.
Thank you. Any final responses on those points?
Thank you, sir. Just to say that the case officers are aware of the 15-metre buffer from the periphery of ancient woodland, and that tends to be highlighted in any planning application submitted that is within, I think it's a 500-metre buffer. So if it's recognised that there's an ancient woodland within a 15-metre buffer plan, then that obviously becomes a concern, a consideration, material consideration. Thank you. So,
thank you. I've got a question on AOMB that's arisen from the statement, the hearing statement from the board. So this was the matters 6 and 7 hearing statement. However, it included some material that was perhaps relevant to today's session. That hopefully you're familiar with it, but I'll take you through the particular point. And it refers to conversions of timber framed stables to dwellings and the potential for cumulative impacts of that kind of development on the AOMB. Now, just in general, have you got any responses to that particular point, if you're familiar with it from the statement? And secondly, whether any modifications will be needed to the plan as a result, or whether the policies in part 1 and part 2 give a taken together, give sufficient steer to the decision taker on how to handle development in the AONB.
So I think it's one of the consequences of adopting what one might call a cellular approach to dealing with the matters, as well as dealing with certain elements of the planning process. And that's that Ms. Knowles hasn't had the opportunity to look at the matter statements for other matters. So I wonder if that's one we can come back to on.
Yes, that's fine. I've just got one other question apart from that on this matter, so we could perhaps take a short break and then come back to that one.
Certainly, thank you.
Okay, so this relates to the local green spaces. So if you could talk me through the proposed main modification 60, please.
Yes, thank you, sir. You raised in your MIQs about whether policy DM19 was consistent with the framework insofar as it requires policies for the management of local green spaces to be consistent with those for managing green belts. And on reflection, sir, we felt that some changes to the wording of DM19 were needed to ensure that consistency with the framework. And so the council has put forward MM60 just to clarify what development would be inappropriate and not inappropriate within local green spaces.
Thanks. Yeah, agree that modification brings the policy into line with the framework in those terms. So, Dr. Leclerc, any more points on local green spaces?
No, thank you, sir.
Thank you. So I think we could take a short break until about 3:15. Will that give you enough time? I think it's, if I can just see if I can find the relevant bits of the. There's no paragraph numbers on this. It looks like, or page numbers, so it's quite difficult to give you any guidance. It's a second page of the document. I think it's the first 3 paragraphs on that.
Thank you, sir. We'll review that.
Okay, thank you. So if we could adjourn now and return at 3:15. Thank you. Okay, if we could resume. So in terms of those points from the AOMB board.
So yes, and thank you for the brief pause. That was very helpful. So the way that the suite of local plan documents will address this issue is principally by reference to LPP1. So as you know, policy RE3 within LPP1 deals with landscape character, and the first issue that it turns its attention to is the Surrey Hills area of outstanding natural beauty. And within the text of that policy, which sets in place what we say is an appropriate level of protection, which was plainly considered to be sound and consistent with national guidance when this plan was adopted, one of the things that it does is draws attention to the Surrey Hills AOMB management plan. So that will be a material planning consideration for the circumstances surrounding any application that affects the AOMB or its setting. And it may not be a document in the examination library, so and we can certainly put the management plan in if you think that's helpful, but I'm going to make a very brief reference to it, which may not require it to go in as an examination document. But the short point is that the point that the representation picks up is dealt with within the management plan, which acknowledges that there is a risk that conversion to farm buildings to other uses can often individually and collectively spoil the landscape. It carries on. Some such buildings are unattractive but met functional agricultural needs. Their attention through conversion can detract from the landscape and no longer be justified for land management purposes. So that management plan will be there as a material planning consideration to be taken into account. The risk has been identified. That can be therefore taken into account in any individual planning application. And so beyond that, insofar as there is thought to be a risk of precedent arising of a particular kind of harm within a particular area, of course, in appropriate circumstances, albeit restricted circumstances, but in appropriate circumstances, the issue of precedent itself can be a material planning consideration. So in those ways, the policy within LPP1 does address this issue, and through the management plan actually addresses it reasonably directly. We say in those circumstances, there is no requirement to have an additional policy within LPP2 in order to render that part of the plan sound. So I hope that's helpful.
Yes, thank you. So I've got no further questions on this matter. Is there anything else, Dr. Leclésio, at this point?
No, thank you very much, sir.
Thank you. Mr. Shepherd?
No, sir, I had no other points unless you wanted to access to private land as part of your site visit to that segment 2D.
I don't think that'll be necessary. Thank you,
That's
Mr.
fine.
Shepherd. So thank you all for your contributions this afternoon. And so the hearing on this matter is closed, and we'll just have a brief break and then go into our action points and housekeeping session for the day. Okay, so just briefly to open up with some thoughts about tomorrow afternoon's session. So I take it there's a council meeting due to start at 6 tomorrow.
So that's correct.
Which means we'd need to be out of here at roughly what sort of time?
So 5:15, really.
So in view of that, and in view of the ground that we've got to cover tomorrow afternoon and the material that I've received from the council, and we're getting quite a lot of requests to submit further written material in response to that. I think it's very likely that the reserve sessions in September might have to be used to carry over some of that discussion. You got any initial views on that?
So I think that's probably something I'd like to take some instructions on. I mean, on the face of it, it'd be a little unfortunate if, having now provided the information that, as it were, we were asked to provide, and one understands why, but we tried to do it in a relatively digestible and standardized format. One would have hoped that those who are well versed in addressing this kind of material ought to be able to deal with it sufficiently around the table tomorrow. So perhaps one can reserve judgment on whether or not it truly is necessary. Because of course, if we, depending on the way your provisional thought process is going, there's potentially quite a significant gap between now and coming back in September. And if that truly becomes necessary, then of course we're in your hands, and we would accept your direction in that respect. But I do wonder whether, as more space is given to fill time, so time becomes filled. It's the nature of that kind of exercise. And actually, the points, I don't want to say too much without the other participants here, but I suppose we're being recorded. So to that extent, if they want to review any of this, they can do. But the points were crystallizing around a few central issues. There are clearly other issues you want to explore as well. But in terms of those central issues, we've got the positions of the respective participants as to how you ought to approach the need for 5 years worth of housing land supply, for example. We've got where the objectors to these parts of the plan will say that the principal difficulties in housing numbers have arisen. That became clear during the sense of the session that we had on the last occasion. And so beyond that, we may be going further into matters of detail that, while they're useful to explore, will not necessarily be central to the conclusions that you might draw at the end of the day. So, but bearing those things in mind, and I certainly don't want to overstep our position as the local planning authority. If, for the time being, the other participants are proceeding on the basis that everyone should be endeavouring to give you the assistance you need to complete this examination on Thursday afternoon, and we see where we get to then. We do have a few hours. Yes, the business will need to be brisk, but say you have been brisk in going through business, and there's no reason why, if everyone else cooperates, that we shouldn't be able to make good progress tomorrow.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Beglan. It's just more in terms of the principle. I want to keep an open mind on it at this stage in terms of how that discussion will go, because obviously we didn't get as far along in that discussion as I'd anticipated. And there's a lot of other ground I would like to cover, particularly in terms of matter 6. Appreciate where you're coming from. There's also there's other items that have been requested over the past week, well, yesterday, in terms of the additional information on some of the sites, which will necessarily come in after the hearings. Again, I'll keep an open mind on that, whether we need further discussion or whether that's something that could be handled in written representations. So we'll see where we get to tomorrow at 5:15. But it was just the principle of using that reserve space, and if it is useful, and if there are sort of further areas where I think discussion would be useful, I'd appreciate being able to use it.
So of course.
Okay, so going through our usual sort of run through. So in terms of matter 9, it was the potential main modification in terms of feasibility and viability in terms of custom or self-build. That broad position on what the expected supply of custom and self-build over the planned period might be as a result of the policy. Then there were the 2 development plans, Mid-Devon and was it Malvern, the other one?
Yes, more than this. Yeah.
This afternoon, I've got the consistent terminology in terms of important and valued trees as a main modification. And that's all I've got. Is there anything further?
So there was just the point of admin that we came back to this afternoon. It's for us to check that we have put the Godalming neighbourhood plan on, and if not, to make sure it gets on.
We've got it.
So in the notes, there's one further suggestion that there was a main modification into the housing conversions policy suggested, and I think you may have suggested 2 different options for that.
Yes, this was the one on the net.
Yes, DM 35 paragraph 2. Yes.
Thank you. Yeah, that was the other one as well. But that's everything that I've got. Okay, so anything else before we wrap up?
So no, thank you.
So thank you for your contributions again today, and we'll resume at 9:30 tomorrow.